Hello viewers all over the world. This channel exists to tell the stories history was never meant to remember. Stories buried under power, silence and respectability. Stories where the truth was too dangerous to write down and too uncomfortable to repeat. Here, we uncover the moments when hidden cruelty was exposed, when quiet suffering was forced into the open, and when the past revealed what it really was. This is Lamenting Souls of the Past, where forgotten lives are given a voice and history is told without permission. If you haven't joined our community yet, please kindly do, because there are some intriguing stories that never made it to the public. Let's get right into the story.
Dark red blood stained the brown waters of the bayou as 23 American alligators, each weighing between 400 and 1,000 pounds, converged on the still-living body tied to a wooden stake in the center of the swamp. Their guttural roars echoed through the Spanish moss-draped cypress trees as their jaws closed one after another on flesh that screamed and begged for mercy. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on August 15th, 1858, and Master Jedediah Rutherford, owner of Riverside Plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, a man who had whipped hundreds of slaves, raped dozens of women, and sold countless children away from their mothers, was discovering that true terror knows no color. But the alligators did not attack by chance. They were trained, conditioned over 18 months, with pork meat thrown always at the same location, always at the same time, always accompanied by the same specific whistle. And the woman who trained them, who spent a year and a half preparing this moment with the patience of an ancestral predator, stood on the bayou's edge, watching her final masterpiece. Her name was Eliza Jackson. She was 34 years old, worked as a cook in the big house at Riverside Plantation, and that night she was executing the most visceral and poetic revenge in Mississippi slavery history. Because the man being devoured alive by alligators was not just her master. He was the man who had drowned her 9-year-old daughter, little Grace, in this same bayou 6 months before, as punishment for Eliza refusing his sexual advances for the 10th time. And as Jedediah Rutherford's screams gradually transformed into agonized gurgles as the alligators performed the death roll that characterizes their killing, tearing limb from limb, Eliza remained motionless in the darkness. Her eyes fixed on the carnage showed neither sadistic pleasure nor guilty remorse, only the cold satisfaction of a mother who finally balanced the scales of justice, the only way the enslaved South understood. Blood for blood, terror for terror, horrible death for horrible death. Eliza Jackson was born in 1824 on a cotton plantation near Natchez, Mississippi, the daughter of 2 enslaved people whose names were lost to history but whose knowledge was not. Her mother, known only as Old Sarah to the white folks, was a woman who remembered Africa, specifically the Dahomey Kingdom, where she had been captured at age 15 during a raid that killed her entire family. She brought with her not just memories of her homeland, but practical knowledge that would save lives and eventually take them. Knowledge of plants that healed and plants that killed. Knowledge of animals and their behaviors. Knowledge of water and swamps and how predators thought. Old Sarah taught Eliza everything she knew, not through formal lessons, but through whispered conversations in the quarters after dark, through demonstration while working in the plantation herb garden, through stories that seemed like entertainment but were actually instruction manuals for survival. By the time Eliza was 10 years old, she could identify 47 different plants by sight, smell, and taste. She knew which ones stopped bleeding, which ones reduced fever, which ones eased childbirth pain, and which ones stopped a human heart in minutes. She knew how to read animal tracks in mud, how to predict rain by watching birds, how to find north by the stars, and how to move through a swamp without disturbing the water. When Eliza was 12, old Sarah died of fever, or so the plantation records claimed. Eliza, holding her mother's hand in the final moments, heard different words. "They will use you. old Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over her labored breathing. The masters will use you in every way they can think of. They will use your body, your children, your labor, your fear. But remember, child, knowledge is the one thing they cannot take. Knowledge lives here. She tapped Eliza's forehead, and here she touched Eliza's heart. Use it wisely. Use it to survive. And if the day comes when survival is no longer enough, use it to teach them that even the powerless have teeth. Those were the last words Eliza heard from the only person who had ever loved her unconditionally. She was sold away from her birthplace 3 months later, beginning a journey through 6 different plantations over the next 15 years. She was sold for being too quiet at one place, too smart at another, too pretty at a third. Each sale separated her from whatever fragile connections she had managed to build. Each sale taught her that forming attachments was dangerous. Each sale reinforced the lesson that in the world of slavery, love was a weapon masters used against you. Until she arrived at Riverside Plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, in March of 1852. She was 28 years old. Evaluated by the slave trader as healthy female, good teeth, experienced house servant, skilled cook, 32 years old, they always added years to make enslaved people seem closer to their useful end, justifying lower prices. Master Jedediah Rutherford purchased her for $800, which he considered a bargain. His previous cook had died of fever the month before, and his household was in disarray. He needed someone competent immediately. Eliza's first impression of Riverside Plantation was that it was both beautiful and terrible in the way only the Deep South could manage. The big house was a magnificent 2-story structure with white columns and wide verandas, surrounded by ancient live oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Behind it stretched 5,000 acres of cotton fields worked by 237 enslaved people. But beyond the cotton fields, in every direction, lay the bayous, those mysterious waterways unique to this part of Mississippi, where the Yazoo River created a maze of swamps, channels, and wetlands that shifted with every season. The bayous were feared by most enslaved people at Riverside. Stories circulated constantly about runaways who tried to escape through the swamps and were never seen again, presumably drowned or eaten by alligators. Overseer Thomas Whitfield encouraged these stories, sometimes embellishing them himself around the quarters, making sure everyone knew that the bayous were death traps for the ignorant. "Them swamps will swallow you whole," he would say. "Gators everywhere, cottonmouths thick as your arm, quicksand patches that'll pull you under before you can scream. Only a fool runs to the bayou." But Eliza saw something different when she looked at the bayous. She saw opportunity. She saw the same ecosystems old Sarah had described from the swamps near Dahomey. She saw the complexity that white men mistook for chaos, and most importantly, she saw the alligators. American alligators, she learned by watching them over her first months at Riverside, were not the mindless killing machines the white folks believed them to be. They were intelligent, patient predators who followed patterns. They had territories they defended, but also routines they maintained. They fed at consistent times. They responded to consistent stimuli. And they could be trained just like dogs or horses if you understood what motivated them and had enough patience. These observations lived quietly in the back of Eliza's mind for the first years at Riverside. She worked in the big house kitchen, preparing 3 meals daily for Master Rutherford, his wife Catherine, their 3 children, and whatever guests happened to be visiting. The work was demanding but preferable to field labor. She had a small cabin to herself near the big house, better than the crowded quarters where field hands slept 20 to a room. She had access to better food, the scraps and leftovers from the master's table. By plantation standards, she had what was considered a good position, but there was no such thing as a good position in slavery. The better your position, The closer you were to the master's family, the more vulnerable you were to their whims, their moods, their violence. House slaves lived under constant scrutiny. Every movement was observed. Every word could be overheard. Every action could be interpreted as insolence, deserving punishment. And for women in the big house, there was always the threat that hung over them like Spanish moss: the master's sexual demands. Master Jedediah Rutherford was 52 years old, a second-generation plantation owner who had inherited Riverside from his father. He was not an unusually cruel master by the standards of 1850s Mississippi, which is to say, he was monstrously cruel by any standard of human decency. He believed firmly in what he called firm discipline, which meant he personally supervised most whippings, regularly ordered 50 to 100 lashes for minor infractions, and maintained a whipping post in full view of the slave quarters as a constant reminder of his authority. He believed enslaved people were property to be used as he saw fit, and he used them accordingly. His wife, Catherine, was 45 years old, the daughter of a Charleston plantation family, who had brought a substantial dowry when she married Jedediah at age 18. She was educated, well-read, could speak French and play piano, and could discuss literature and philosophy with visitors in the parlor. She was also casually, thoughtlessly cruel in the way only someone who had never questioned their own supremacy could be. She saw enslaved people as furniture with voices, useful when functioning properly, annoying when they malfunctioned. She had personally designed the disciplinary corset, a leather contraption fitted with metal spikes on the inside that was forced onto enslaved women who developed attitudes, causing agonizing pain with every breath, but leaving no external marks. Their children, Nathaniel, age 23, Elizabeth, age 20, and Jonathan, age 17, had learned cruelty from their parents, the way other children learned their letters. Nathaniel, who was being groomed to inherit the plantation, had a particular fondness for using his riding crop on enslaved children who didn't move out of his way fast enough. Elizabeth enjoyed forcing enslaved women to stand motionless while she practiced sticking pins in their arms, giggling at each flinch. Jonathan preferred psychological torture, making elaborate promises of freedom or reward, and then laughing when desperate people believed him. Overseer Thomas Whitfield was a different breed of cruel. He was not plantation-born like the Rutherford family. He was poor white trash from Tennessee, who had worked his way up from nothing and saw his position as proof of white superiority. He needed to believe that his pale skin made him inherently better than the enslaved people he supervised, because without that belief he would have to face the fact that he was just as exploited by the plantation system, just in different ways. This made him viciously, desperately brutal. He carried a bullwhip coiled at his belt always, and he used it at least twice daily. He kept careful records of every lashing, every punishment, every death, documenting the systematic destruction of human bodies with the same care other men kept financial ledgers. This was the world Eliza inhabited. She kept her eyes down, her voice soft, her movements efficient. She learned the routines of the big house: breakfast at 7 o'clock, dinner at 1 o'clock, supper at 7 o'clock. She learned Master Rutherford's preferences: coffee black and scalding hot, bacon crispy, eggs runny, cornbread with extra butter, whiskey after supper. She learned Mistress Catherine's demands: tea at specific temperature, specific delicate foods, presentation mattering as much as taste. She learned to be invisible while being indispensable, the impossible balance every house slave had to maintain. For 3 years, this was her life: invisible, indispensable, surviving. And then, in April of 1855, everything changed. Her daughter arrived. Grace was born in the quarters to a field hand named Mary, a woman Eliza had befriended during her first year at Riverside. Mary had been pregnant when Eliza met her, carrying a child conceived through rape by one of the white overseers from a neighboring plantation who had been borrowing slaves for breeding purposes. Mary died in childbirth, bleeding to death over 6 agonizing hours, while the plantation's white doctor was away delivering a white woman's baby in Vicksburg. The midwife did everything she could, but some damage cannot be fixed with herbs and prayers. Mary's last words, whispered to Eliza as her life drained away, were simple. "Take her, keep her safe, promise me," Eliza promised. And though she had tried for 3 years to avoid forming attachments, though she had learned that love was a weapon, though she knew better than to hope, she fell completely, irrevocably in love with the tiny, squalling infant placed in her arms. Grace. Named for the only mercy in a merciless world, the unexpected gift of something to live for beyond mere survival. Master Rutherford allowed Eliza to keep Grace in her cabin, not out of kindness, but because it was economically sensible. A crying baby in the quarters disturbed field hands who needed sleep. A baby near the big house could be supervised, and when old enough, trained as a house servant from infancy. This was good plantation management, nothing more. For 3 years, Grace was Eliza's world. She taught her daughter everything old Sarah had taught her: the plants, the animals, the swamp knowledge, the survival skills. She sang to her the songs old Sarah had sung, songs in languages neither of them fully understood anymore, but which carried the weight of Africa in their rhythms. She told her stories of Dahomey warriors, of women who fought like men, of kingdoms where black people ruled themselves. She taught Grace to be quiet around white folks, to move quickly when ordered, to never meet their eyes directly, to survive. Grace was brilliant. By age 6, she could identify 30 plants by sight. By 7, she could calculate measurements in her head faster than Eliza could speak them. By 8, she could read. Eliza had taught her secretly using a discarded primer Jonathan Rutherford had thrown away, teaching her late at night by firelight, knowing that literacy was forbidden, but believing knowledge was worth the risk. And Grace was beautiful. She had her mother's features, but softer, her skin a few shades lighter from some white ancestor's violence, her eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity that slavery hadn't yet crushed. She smiled easily, laughed often, and somehow maintained hope that Eliza had lost decades ago. It was that beauty that doomed her. Master Jedediah Rutherford noticed Grace around the time she turned 8, noticed the way she was growing, noticed that she was developing into someone who would, in a few more years, be the object of the kind of attention he regularly forced on enslaved women. And in noticing this, he apparently decided to accelerate his usual timeline. The first time he cornered Eliza, in January of 1858, he was direct about what he wanted. Not her. She was 34, past the age he typically preferred. But Grace, 9 years old, working in the kitchen after school hours learning her mother's trade. He wanted access. He wanted Eliza to make arrangements. He wanted her cooperation in the ongoing rape of her own daughter. Eliza refused, not dramatically, not visibly. She simply said, with eyes downcast, voice respectful, "Master, she's just a child. Please, not yet." The "not yet" was strategic, implying eventual compliance while buying time. Master Rutherford was not pleased, but he was patient. Rape was more satisfying when the victim was properly terrified, properly broken. He could wait a few months, let the anticipation build. He told Eliza he would revisit the conversation in spring. The second time, in March, he was less polite. He cornered Eliza in the root cellar, pressed her against the wall, made it clear that his patience was ending. "That girl is mine," he said, "same as you're mine. Same as everything on this plantation is mine. I'm giving you a choice now, but I won't keep giving it. You help me, or I take what I want anyway and you watch. Which do you prefer? Eliza, pinned against the cold stone wall, smelling bourbon on his breath, feeling his hands on her body, said the only thing she could say, "Please, master, give me time. Let me prepare her. Make it easier, please." He agreed. 2 months, until May. The third time was in April, and he had run out of patience. He didn't corner Eliza, he simply took Grace. Eliza came back from the market in Vicksburg, where she had been sent to purchase supplies, and Grace was gone. She found her daughter 3 hours later, found her in Master Rutherford's private study, found her crying and bleeding and broken in ways that would never fully heal. Eliza carried Grace to their cabin, cleaned her gently, held her while she shook, applied salves to the injuries, whispered love and apologies and promises of protection that they both knew were lies. And while she did this, while she tended to her daughter's brutalized body, something fundamental shifted inside Eliza Jackson. The part of her that had been carefully controlled for 34 years, the part that old Sarah's wisdom had kept tamped down because uncontrolled rage got enslaved people killed, that part finally snapped free of its restraints. But it didn't explode outward in a frenzy of immediate violence. Instead, it crystallized into something colder, harder, more dangerous. A determination, a decision. She would kill Jedediah Rutherford, but not quickly, not mercifully, not in any way that would be traced back to her or endanger Grace. She would kill him in a way that would terrify him first, that would make him understand what true helplessness felt like, that would balance the scales of justice with the kind of poetic symmetry old Sarah had always told her the ancestors demanded. She began planning that night, and the plan that formed in her mind returned, again and again, to the bayous, to the alligators, to the patient predators that waited in the murky water, intelligent enough to learn, powerful enough to destroy completely, leaving no evidence beyond scattered bones. For the next 3 weeks, while Grace healed physically if not mentally, Eliza began her preparations. She started walking to the bayou every evening after supper was finished, telling anyone who asked that she was collecting herbs that grew near the water. This was true, she did collect herbs, but it was not the whole truth. She was also studying the alligators. She identified 23 large ones that regularly inhabited a particular section of bayou about half a mile from the plantation buildings. This section was ideal for her purposes, deep enough that a body would sink initially, hidden enough that screams wouldn't carry to the quarters, close enough that she could access it easily, but far enough that it wasn't part of regular patrol routes. She began feeding them, small amounts at first, pork scraps from the kitchen that she had permission to dispose of anyway. She would arrive at sunset, always at the same time, and throw the meat into a specific spot in the water. The first few times, the alligators ignored her or approached cautiously. But alligators are opportunistic feeders, and free food is free food. Within a week, they were anticipating her arrival. Within 2 weeks, they were congregating at that specific spot at sunset, waiting. She added a whistle, a specific 3-note pattern that old Sarah had taught her, a sound that carried across water but didn't sound human. She would whistle, then throw the meat. Whistle, meat, whistle, meat. Classical conditioning, the same principle that trained hunting dogs, applied to apex predators. By the end of 3 weeks, the pattern was established. Sunset whistle meant food at that exact location in the bayou. The alligators, creatures of habit and hunger, had learned. Then, on May 2nd, 1858, everything went wrong. Master Rutherford, perhaps worried that Eliza was planning to run away with Grace, perhaps just exercising his perceived right to absolute control, decided to separate them. Not through sale. Grace was too young to bring good money yet, but through reassignment. He informed Eliza that Grace would be moved to the quarters where she would begin field work. This was punishment, relegating a skilled house servant to brutal field labor. But more than that, it was isolation. It separated mother from daughter, put Grace under the direct supervision of Overseer Whitfield, and made it clear that Eliza had no power whatsoever to protect her child. Eliza begged. She actually begged, something she had sworn never to do. She went to Master Rutherford's study, knelt before him, and pleaded for him to reconsider, promised anything, promised everything, offered herself completely if he would just let Grace stay. Master Rutherford, sitting behind his mahogany desk with a glass of bourbon, looked at her with something like amusement. "I've already had you," he said, "and her. Why would I negotiate for what I already own? No, I think the girl needs to learn her place. Field work will break that prideful spirit. Give her a few months in the cotton rows. See if she's more cooperative after that." Eliza tried again. "Master, please." "Enough," he cut her off. "You're dismissed. And if I hear any more begging, the girl gets worse than field work. She goes to the breeding sheds. We could use her for that in a few years. Is that what you want?" It wasn't. Eliza left. That night, Grace moved to the quarters. Eliza watched her daughter walk away, carrying the one spare dress she owned, heading toward the crowded building where she would sleep on wooden planks with 30 other field hands. Grace looked back once, her face showing confusion and fear, but also determination to be brave for her mother. That look, that moment, branded itself into Eliza's mind with searing permanence. For 2 months, Eliza saw her daughter only briefly. Grace worked in the cotton fields from sunrise to sunset, her small hands developing calluses, her back developing permanent pain from the constant bending, her spirit slowly being crushed under the weight of labor designed for adults. She lost weight. She stopped smiling. She stopped talking much. The light in her eyes, that beautiful curiosity and hope, began to dim. Eliza continued her bayou visits, now with renewed purpose. She increased the amount of meat she fed the alligators. She extended the conditioning period. She tested different locations in the water, finding the optimal spot where a body could be secured but would still be accessible to the alligators. She planned every detail with the obsessive precision of someone who would only get one chance to execute her vengeance. And then, on July 14th, 1858, Grace died. She drowned in the bayou. That was the official story. She had been sent to collect water for the field hands during the midday break, had apparently slipped on the muddy bank, fallen in, and drowned before anyone could save her. Tragic accident. These things happened. Enslaved people died all the time. Master Rutherford noted the loss in his plantation ledger. Negro girl Grace, age 9, drowned July 14th. Value loss, $400 estimated future worth. But Eliza, when she saw her daughter's body pulled from the water, saw the bruises, saw the marks on her throat, saw the terror frozen in Grace's dead eyes, and she heard the whispers from other enslaved people who had been working nearby. Whispers that Grace hadn't been collecting water alone, that Master Rutherford had been there, that there had been another argument, another refusal, another attempt to break her will, that Grace had fought back this time, had bitten his hand when he touched her, that he had responded with rage, with hands around her small throat, with her body thrown into the bayou like garbage after she stopped breathing, murder disguised as accident, violence covered by the system that permitted violence, the death of a 9-year-old child, recorded as a mere property loss. Eliza did not cry at Grace's burial. She did not scream or wail or tear her clothes. She stood silent while the other enslaved people sang spirituals, while Grace's tiny body was lowered into a grave in the far corner of the plantation cemetery, where enslaved people were buried without markers. She stood silent while Overseer Whitfield told everyone to get back to work, that they had already wasted enough time on this. She stood silent while Master Rutherford returned to the big house without a word, without a thought, without a moment of guilt. She stood silent because she was no longer Eliza the cook, Eliza the mother, Eliza the survivor. She had become something else entirely, something that did not cry or scream, something that planned. That night, she walked to the bayou for the final time as a planner. She whistled the three-note pattern. The alligators, as trained, congregated at their usual spot. She threw them an entire butchered pig, the most food they had ever received from her. She watched them feed, their powerful jaws crushing bone, their death rolls tearing flesh, their efficiency in consumption. And she smiled for the first time since Grace had died. A smile with no warmth in it whatsoever. Soon, she whispered to the darkness. Very soon. For 1 month, she perfected her plan. She identified the ideal night, August 15th, when Master Rutherford would return late from a monthly drinking session with other plantation owners in Vicksburg. She had observed this pattern for years. Once a month, he would travel to town for an evening of cards, bourbon, and probably brothels, returning between midnight and 3 in the morning. He always returned alone, riding his favorite horse, always taking the same route that passed near the bayou. She prepared the location. She identified a specific cypress tree whose low-hanging branches could secure a rope. She tested different types of knots, finding which ones could be tied quickly in darkness and would hold a struggling person. She calculated distances, angles, timing. She rehearsed her movements until they were instinctive. She prepared herself. She stopped eating meat, subsisting only on vegetables and bread, believing that predators could smell flesh-eaters. She bathed in bayou water mixed with mud, masking her human scent. She practiced moving through the swamp silently, learned which paths were solid and which would sink beneath her weight. She became, in essence, part of the bayou ecosystem. And finally, on the night of August 14th, she prepared the final element, the drug. Among the plants she had been collecting from the bayou was Jimson weed, a powerful hallucinogen and muscle relaxant in the right doses. She brewed a tea from the seeds, strong enough to incapacitate but not kill, and she added it to Master Rutherford's evening whiskey before he left for Vicksburg. Just a small amount. Just enough that when it took effect, hours later on his ride home, he would become disoriented, weak, vulnerable. Everything was in place. All she had to do was wait. Master Rutherford returned from Vicksburg at 1:30 in the morning on August 15th. Eliza, hidden in the cypress shadows near the bayou crossing, heard his horse approaching from 100 yards away. She heard him humming, drunk and satisfied with his evening's entertainment. She heard the horse slow as it approached the water crossing, the animal instinctively cautious of the dark bayou. She heard Master Rutherford curse as he swayed in his saddle, the Jimson weed tea finally taking full effect. She heard him struggle to stay upright. She heard the moment he lost his balance and fell, hitting the muddy ground with a wet thud. She moved quickly. He was conscious but weak, confused, struggling to stand. She hit him once with a thick cypress branch, hard enough to stun but not kill. His horse, startled, bolted into the darkness. Good. One less witness. She dragged him to the water's edge. He was heavy, but she had been doing plantation labor for 34 years. She had strength most people didn't credit her with. She got him to the location she had prepared beneath the specific cypress tree, in the specific spot where the alligators had been conditioned to expect food. She tied him to a stake driven deep into the muddy bottom, positioned so his body would be mostly submerged, but his head above water. She needed him conscious for what came next. She needed him to understand. She waited 15 minutes for the drug to wear off enough that he was alert. She watched his confusion transform into realization, watched realization become fear. She watched fear become terror. "Do you know where you are?" she asked quietly. He stared at her. "Eliza, what? What are you doing? What happened?" "You're in the bayou," she said. "The same bayou where you killed my daughter. Do you remember, Grace?" Recognition flickered in his eyes. Not guilt, just memory. "The girl? That was an accident. She slipped. You choked her," Eliza said flatly. "Then you threw her body in the water. I saw the bruises, everyone saw them. But nobody could say anything because you own us. You own our bodies, our labor, our children, our deaths. You think you own everything. Listen," he said, his voice taking on the commanding tone he used when issuing orders. "Whatever you think happened, you're wrong. And you need to untie me right now. This is insubordination. This is rebellion. Do you understand what happens to rebellious slaves? They hang them, they burn them, I know what they do," Eliza interrupted. "I've watched it. I've seen men whipped to death. I've seen women branded. I've seen children sold. I know exactly what white men do to black people who refuse to submit. But you see, Master Rutherford, I'm not planning to survive this. I stopped planning for survival the day you murdered my daughter." The fear in his eyes intensified. "If you kill me, they'll torture you. They'll make an example. They have to catch me first," Eliza said, "and they have to find your body, and they have to prove what happened, none of which will be possible after tonight." She reached into her dress and pulled out a small piece of dried pork. She held it up where he could see it. "For 18 months, she said, "I've been training the alligators in this bayou every day at sunset. I come here and feed them, same location, same time, same whistle." She demonstrated the 3-note pattern. In the darkness, she heard the splashing response as large bodies moved through the water. They've learned that this whistle means food. They've learned that this exact spot in the bayou is where food appears. And now, Master Rutherford, you're tied to a stake in that exact spot. His eyes widened. He began to struggle against the ropes, pulling frantically. "No, no, you can't. Eliza, please. I'm sorry about the girl. We can fix this. I'll buy you another child. Her name was Grace," Eliza said. "And she wasn't something you buy. She was my daughter. She was 9 years old. She could read. She knew 30 plants by name. She laughed at bird songs. She had dreams. And you killed her because she refused to let you rape her, because she had dignity you couldn't break." She threw the pork into the water near his body. The alligators responded immediately. The water churned. Dark shapes, massive and ancient, converged on the location. Master Rutherford's struggles became frantic. He screamed, high-pitched and terrified. "Please! Oh, God! Please, don't do this! Eliza, I'll free you. I'll write papers. You can't free me," Eliza said quietly. "Free people don't do what you trained me to do. Free people don't smile while serving their daughter's murderer breakfast. Free people don't keep living when every reason to live is dead. You didn't make me free, Master Rutherford. You made me into this. And now you're going to pay for what you created." She whistled again, 3 notes, clear and carrying. The first alligator struck his legs beneath the water, 13 feet long, 800 pounds of muscle and teeth and evolutionary perfection. Its jaws closed on his left thigh, and it performed the death roll, spinning in the water, tearing flesh from bone. Master Rutherford's scream was inhuman. Pure agony, pure terror, the sound of a man who had inflicted pain for decades, finally understanding what pain truly meant. The other alligators, attracted by the blood and the thrashing, joined. They attacked from multiple angles, their feeding frenzy efficient and brutal, his right leg, his left arm, his torso, each bite taking pounds of flesh, each roll breaking bones, each moment extending his suffering. Eliza watched. She stood on the bank, 5 feet from the carnage, close enough to see every detail in the moonlight, close enough to hear every scream, every plea, every prayer he choked out between mouthfuls of bayou water and his own blood, close enough to see the exact moment when he realized that no one was coming to save him, that he would die here in agony and terror and complete helplessness, close enough to whisper for him and for Grace and for herself, "This is for every mother whose child you sold, for every woman you raped, for every person you whipped, for every life you destroyed because you could. This is justice, Master Rutherford, and justice has teeth." His screams gradually faded into gurgles as the water and his own blood filled his throat. The alligators continued their work, methodical and thorough. Within 20 minutes, there was nothing recognizable left. Within an hour, the body was consumed completely, torn into pieces, small enough to digest, pulled into the deep water where it would decompose rapidly in the warm Mississippi summer. When Eliza finally left the bayou at 3 o'clock in the morning, there was no evidence of what had happened, just dark water, patient alligators, and the silence of a warm August night. She washed carefully in a different part of the bayou, cleaning away any blood that might have splattered on her clothes. She buried the rope and the stake deep in the mud where they would rot quickly. She returned to her cabin, lay down on her narrow bed, and slept dreamlessly for the first time since Grace had died. The next morning, she woke at her usual time, built the cooking fire, and began preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. Biscuits, bacon, coffee. The same breakfast she had prepared 1,000 times before. When Mistress Catherine came down at 7 o'clock and asked if Master Rutherford had returned from Vicksburg yet, Eliza answered truthfully, "I haven't seen him this morning, mistress." By noon, when he still hadn't appeared, the alarm was raised. Overseer Whitfield organized a search party. They found Master Rutherford's horse wandering loose near the bayou crossing. They found tracks showing where someone had fallen. They found scuff marks suggesting a struggle. They searched the bayou itself, poking the water with long sticks, looking for a body. They never found one. Alligators are efficient feeders, and they had been very well trained. The official conclusion, reached after 3 days of searching, was that Master Rutherford had gotten drunk in Vicksburg, fallen from his horse during the ride home, and either drowned in the bayou or was eaten by alligators. Tragic accident. These things happened. The Mississippi bayous were dangerous. No one suspected Eliza. Why would they? She was property, not a person. She was a cook, not a threat. She had been seen in her cabin by other enslaved people throughout the night, hadn't she? And even if suspicions had been raised, what evidence was there? A missing man, a dark bayou, hungry alligators, no body, no witnesses, no proof. Mistress Catherine, now the widow Rutherford, took control of the plantation. She hired a new overseer. Life continued, cotton grew and was harvested. Enslaved people worked and suffered and died. The world moved on, as it always did, indifferent to individual tragedy. But something had changed. The enslaved people at Riverside Plantation, particularly those who had known Grace, looked at Eliza differently. They didn't speak of it openly, but there was understanding in their eyes, a recognition. The night after Master Rutherford disappeared, old Martha from the quarters came to Eliza's cabin with a small cloth bundle. Inside was a carved wooden bird, the kind Grace had loved to watch. "She'd want you to have this," Martha said. Then more quietly, "Some accidents happen right on time." Eliza took the carving. "Yes," she said, "they do." Word spread through the slave network, that invisible communication system that connected plantations across the South. Whispers about the disappeared master. Whispers about the bayou. Whispers about justice with teeth. The story grew with each telling, embellished and modified, but the core remained. There was a woman at Riverside Plantation who had fed her master to alligators, and she had never been caught. For Mistress Catherine and the new overseer, this presented a problem. They couldn't punish anyone without proof. But the whispered stories were creating an atmosphere of dangerous possibility. The idea that a master could be killed, that vengeance was possible, that enslaved people had power. This was more threatening than any individual act of rebellion. They responded with increased brutality, more whippings, longer hours, stricter surveillance. They wanted to reassert control through fear. But fear, once it has infected the oppressor class, cannot be easily eliminated. Mistress Catherine started locking her bedroom door at night. The new overseer began carrying 2 pistols instead of 1. White visitors to the plantation found themselves looking at house servants with new suspicion. And Eliza, she continued cooking, continued serving meals, continued bowing her head and saying yes, mistress, and no mistress, and existing in the role slavery had assigned her. But there was something different in her eyes now, something the white folks couldn't quite identify, but that made them uncomfortable. A knowledge, a quiet confidence, the look of someone who had balanced the scales and found peace in vengeance. She lived 9 more years at Riverside Plantation, 9 years of cooking, cleaning, obeying, 9 years of watching cotton grow and be harvested, 9 years of survival in the system that had killed her daughter and countless others. She never attempted escape. She never rebelled again. She had done what she needed to do, and she would live with the consequences, whatever they might be. In April of 1861, the Civil War began. By April of 1865, it ended with Confederate defeat and the abolition of slavery. Eliza Jackson, now aged 41, walked away from Riverside Plantation on the day news of freedom reached Warren County. She walked north without looking back, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the wooden bird carving Martha had given her. She settled in Vicksburg, found work as a cook in a hotel, and lived quietly for another 33 years. She never married, she never had other children, she never spoke publicly about Grace or Master Rutherford or the night at the bayou. When asked about her past, she would simply say she had been enslaved at Riverside Plantation and leave it at that. But in private, in the small black church she attended every Sunday, in conversations with other formerly enslaved people, the story was told. The story of Eliza of Mississippi, the story of the mother who trained alligators, the story of justice that came with teeth and scales, and the cold patience of predators who waited millions of years for their moment. When Eliza Jackson died in 1898 at age 74, her funeral was attended by over 200 people. Formerly enslaved people came from across Mississippi to pay respects. They sang spirituals, they told stories, and they buried her with the wooden bird carving clutched in her hands, a reminder of the daughter for whom vengeance had been taken, for whom justice had been served, for whom the scales had been balanced. The Riverside Plantation still exists, though under different ownership and different purposes. The big house is a museum now, carefully preserved, its history sanitized for tourist consumption. They talk about architecture and cotton economics and the complexity of the antebellum period. They do not talk about the 237 enslaved people who worked those fields. They do not talk about Grace or Eliza, or the night Master Rutherford disappeared. But in Warren County, particularly among black families whose ancestors survived slavery, the story persists. The story of the bayou, the story of the alligators, the story of the woman who proved that even those, stripped of every freedom, every right, every protection, could find ways to resist, to fight back, to claim justice when the law offered none. Eliza Jackson never wrote her story down. She couldn't write when she was enslaved, and when she gained freedom and literacy, she chose silence over documentation. But her story survived anyway, passed through generations, adapted and retold, but never forgotten. Because some stories are too important to forget. Some stories remind us that resistance takes many forms. Some stories prove that even the most powerless among us possess power if we're desperate enough and patient enough and willing to pay the price. This is one of those stories. The story of Eliza of Mississippi, who fed her master to alligators and walked away free, in every sense that matters. the story of a mother's love and a mother's vengeance. The story of grace lost and justice found in the dark waters of a Mississippi bayou. If you're feeling rage right now, you should. This story, while specific details are dramatized for storytelling, represents real patterns of violence, real destruction of families, real desperate acts of resistance that happened throughout the American slavery period. Mothers really lost children. Children really were murdered. And sometimes, very rarely, enslaved people found ways to strike back. History remembers Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Nat Turner, the famous resistors whose names survived in written records. But for every famous name, there were thousands whose resistance was quieter, more personal, more intimate. The cook who slowly poisoned her master, the field hand who sabotaged equipment, the mother who found a way to take vengeance for her murdered child. These stories were erased from official records, but they survived in oral traditions, in whispered conversations, in the collective memory of communities who refused to forget. Eliza Jackson's story reminds us that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were human beings with agency, intelligence, and the capacity for strategic action. They were people who loved, who grieved, who planned, who resisted, and sometimes, when pushed beyond all reasonable limits, they became exactly what their oppressors feared most: dangerous. The American slavery period lasted 246 years. During that time, millions of people lived and died in bondage. Millions of stories that will never be told. Millions of acts of resistance that were never recorded. Millions of Grace Jacksons who died too young. And millions of Eliza Jacksons who found ways to survive, and sometimes, rarely, to take justice into their own hands. We remember these stories not to glorify violence, but to acknowledge truth. The truth that slavery was built on violence and maintained through violence. The truth that when law offers no protection, humans find other ways to seek justice. The truth that every system of oppression creates its own resistance, and that resistance takes forms the oppressors never anticipate. We remember these stories because forgetting them dishonors both the victims and the survivors. Forgetting them allows the sanitization of history, the comfortable lies that make slavery seem less horrific than it was. Forgetting them erases the humanity of people who fought back, who refused to accept their dehumanization, who proved that the human spirit cannot be completely crushed even under the most brutal conditions. And we remember these stories because the fight for justice continues. Slavery ended in 1865, but its legacies persist in mass incarceration, in police violence, in economic inequality, in educational disparities, in the ongoing struggle for Black lives to matter in America. The methods have changed, but the essential dynamic remains: a system that devalues Black lives and people who refuse to accept that devaluation. Eliza Jackson's story, told here as historical fiction but grounded in documented patterns of resistance, stands as testament to that refusal. She refused to accept Grace's murder as just another tragedy to be endured. She refused to let her daughter's life be reduced to a $400 property loss in a plantation ledger. She refused to survive without seeking balance. Was what she did murder? Yes, by any legal definition. Was it justice? That question has no simple answer. Justice under slavery was impossible because the law itself was unjust. The legal system protected masters and criminalized enslaved people. It made rape legal and resistance illegal. It valued property over personhood. In such a system, what does justice even mean? Perhaps the better question is, what would you do? If your child was brutalized and murdered, if the perpetrator faced no consequences, if the law offered no protection, if survival meant serving your child's killer breakfast every morning, what would you do? Could you maintain nonviolent resistance? Could you wait for systemic change that might not come for 100 years? Could you forgive? These are not academic questions. These were the real daily questions enslaved people faced. And their answers varied. Some maintained faith that God would deliver justice. Some focused on survival and hope for freedom. Some found small ways to resist. And some, like Eliza, found ways to take justice into their own hands. We honor all these responses. We honor those who survived through submission because survival itself was resistance. We honor those who escaped because claiming freedom was revolutionary. We honor those who rebelled openly because they proved that enslaved people could fight. And we honor those who took quieter, deadlier vengeance because they proved that oppressors were never truly safe. The alligators of the Mississippi bayous still hunt in those dark waters. They've been there for millions of years, and they'll be there for millions more. They don't care about human history, about slavery or freedom, about justice or vengeance. They're just predators doing what predators do, hunting, feeding, surviving. But for the black people of Warren County who know the story, those alligators carry a different meaning. They're a reminder that nature itself can become a weapon when wielded with intelligence and patience. They're a symbol of the hidden power that exists in places oppressors fear to go. They're proof that sometimes justice has teeth and scales and cold reptilian patience. And for anyone who hears Eliza's story and feels that visceral satisfaction of imagined vengeance, that's worth examining too. Why does this story satisfy us? What does it tell us about justice denied and justice claimed? What does it reveal about our own relationships to power, violence, and resistance? These are the conversations we should be having. Not sanitized discussions about a complicated past, but honest reckonings with the brutality of slavery, the humanity of the enslaved, and the ongoing struggle to create true justice in a society still shaped by that history. Eliza Jackson fed her master to alligators in 1858. Grace Jackson died at age 9 because